My name is Dante Vasquez, and I'm a dam engineer who survived the first 6 months of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and ash blocked out the sun, I was one of the few people who understood what freezing temperatures would do to America's water infrastructure. While civilization collapsed around me, I became the keeper of knowledge that could save millions or get me killed. Every decision I made determined which communities lived and which froze to death. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dante Vasquez, and I should have trusted my calculations. I worked as a dam operations specialist at Hoover Dam for 12 years, managing water flow across 7 states and keeping the lights on for 40 million people. They called me Ripple because I understood something most people never think about: how small changes upstream create massive effects downstream. What I'm about to tell you isn't just about surviving an ice age. It's about watching civilization's circulatory system slowly freeze to death, and how I became one of the last people who understood how it all worked. September 20th, 2024 started like any other Tuesday. I was deep inside Hoover Dam's power plant, doing routine maintenance on Generator Unit 3. The concrete walls around me hummed with the constant vibration of water rushing through turbines, a sound I'd grown to love over the years. Above me, Lake Mead stretched out like a blue jewel in the desert, holding back 26 million acre-feet of water that kept Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles alive. My grandfather had been a water engineer too, back when they were building the Central Arizona Project. He used to tell me that water was the blood of the West, and engineers like us were the doctors keeping the patient alive. I carried his old survey maps in my truck, hand-drawn charts of every spring, well, and creek between the Rockies and the Pacific. Those maps would later save my life more times than I can count. That morning, I was running my usual calculations: inflow rates from the Colorado River, power generation capacity, water releases to downstream users. Everything had to balance perfectly. Too much release, and we'd drain the reservoir. Too little, and we'd flood upstream communities. It was mathematics that meant life or death for millions of people, but most folks never thought about it. They just turned on their faucets and expected water to come out. My supervisor Jenkins found me elbow-deep in the generator housing around 10:30. He was a good man, been at the dam for 28 years, but he never understood the bigger picture like I did. Jenkins saw water as something to be managed day by day. I saw it as a living system where everything connected to everything else. A drought in Wyoming affected dinner tables in San Diego. A broken pump in Nevada could shut down factories in California. "Ripple, you're overthinking again," Jenkins said, watching me check pressure readings for the 3rd time that morning. "These systems have been running smooth for decades. Sometimes I think you worry too much about what could go wrong." I should have told him right then that worrying about what could go wrong was exactly what kept disasters from happening. Instead, I just nodded and kept working. I was adjusting a flow meter when my phone started buzzing with emergency alerts at exactly 11:47 in the morning. The first alert was from the U.S. Geological Survey. Major seismic activity detected in Yellowstone National Park region. Then came the second alert from the National Weather Service. Volcanic eruption confirmed at Yellowstone caldera. Ashfall expected across multiple states. By the time the 3rd alert came through from FEMA, Jenkins and half the crew were crowded around the break room television. The footage was like nothing I'd ever seen. A massive column of ash and debris rising into the sky like God's own middle finger, stretching higher than commercial aircraft could fly. The news anchors kept using words like unprecedented and catastrophic, but I was already running different calculations in my head. Ash clouds that size would spread across the continent within days. All that particulate matter in the atmosphere would block sunlight and drop temperatures. While everyone else watched the news coverage, I was at my computer running climate models. I pulled up historical data from Mount Tambora in 1815 and Krakatoa in 1883. Both eruptions had caused global temperature drops and crop failures, but Yellowstone was different. Yellowstone was what geologists called a supervolcano, capable of ejecting hundreds of times more material into the atmosphere. I started calculating water flow projections for sub-freezing temperatures across the Colorado River basin. The numbers seemed impossible then, but they would prove inevitable in the weeks to come. If temperatures dropped by 40 or 50 degrees, ice would form in places that hadn't seen freezing weather in recorded history. Rivers would slow, then stop completely. Water treatment plants designed for desert climates would fail. Pipes would burst. Pumping stations would freeze solid. Jenkins found me still at the computer 2 hours later, surrounded by printouts of weather models and water system schematics. Ripple, what are you doing? This is a volcano in Wyoming. We're in Nevada. That ash cloud isn't even headed our direction. It doesn't matter which direction it's headed, I told him. Ash clouds this size circle the globe. Within a week, that debris will be blocking sunlight from Alaska to Mexico. Temperatures are going to drop fast, Jenkins. Faster than anyone's prepared for. He looked at my calculations like I was speaking a foreign language. You're being paranoid, Ripple. It's just ash. It'll settle in a few days, and everything will go back to normal. But I could see it wouldn't be normal. I could see the ripple effects spreading out like cracks in ice. The Colorado River system supplied water to 7 states and 40 million people. Every gallon that flowed through our turbines eventually reached kitchen sinks in Los Angeles, irrigation systems in Imperial Valley, and swimming pools in Phoenix. If that system failed, if those rivers froze solid, those 40 million people would die of thirst long before they died of cold. I spent the rest of that afternoon calling contacts at other facilities along the river. Glen Canyon Dam upstream. From us, Davis Dam downstream, the California Aqueduct System. Salt River Project in Arizona. Most of the engineers I talked to were concerned, but not panicking. They were thinking like Jenkins, assuming this was a temporary disruption that would sort itself out. Only one person took my warning seriously. Maria Santos worked water treatment for the city of Phoenix, and she'd been tracking the ash clouds spread on satellite imagery. Dante, I'm seeing temperature drops already, she told me over the phone. It's only been 6 hours since the eruption, and we're down 3 degrees. If this keeps up, we're looking at infrastructure failures across the entire Southwest. Maria understood what I understood. Water systems in desert regions weren't designed for freezing temperatures. Pipes ran above ground or in shallow trenches. Pumping stations relied on equipment that would seize up if water froze inside the mechanisms. Treatment plants used chemical processes that required specific temperature ranges to function properly. By evening, the ash cloud was visible from Hoover Dam, a dark smudge spreading across the northern sky like an oil spill. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees since morning, and weather services were predicting it would keep falling. I went home to my apartment in Boulder City and spent the night creating emergency protocols for cold weather dam operations. Procedures that had never been needed in the 90-year history of Hoover Dam. The next morning, I arrived at work to find Jenkins in his office, staring at weather reports on his computer screen. The ash cloud had spread faster than anyone expected, covering most of the western United States and continuing to expand. Temperatures across Nevada had dropped another 6 degrees overnight. Maybe you weren't being paranoid, Jenkins admitted. But this is still temporary, right? Volcanic ash settles. Temperatures go back to normal. We just need to weather the storm. I wanted to agree with him, but the data told a different story. I showed him historical examples of volcanic winters, periods when major eruptions had caused global climate changes lasting months or even years. The year without a summer in 1816. The dust veil event of 536 AD. Each time, ash and debris in the atmosphere had blocked enough sunlight to disrupt weather patterns and drop temperatures worldwide. This isn't just weather, Jenkins, I explained. This is climate change happening in real time. That ash isn't going to settle in a few days. It's going to stay in the upper atmosphere for months, maybe years. And while it's up there, it's going to keep blocking sunlight and dropping temperatures. By the end of September, I knew I was right. The ash cloud had circled the globe twice, creating a gray haze that blocked out the sun even at midday. Temperatures in Las Vegas had fallen from their normal 85 degrees to 65 degrees, a 20-degree drop in just 10 days. Phoenix was seeing similar changes. Los Angeles reporting the coldest September on record. But the real proof came from watching the Colorado River itself. Water temperatures were dropping faster than air temperatures, and I started seeing ice formations along the shoreline of Lake Mead. Not thick ice, just thin sheets that formed overnight and melted during the day. But it was ice where ice had never formed before, and I knew it was just the beginning. October was when the ripple effects really started showing. The first agricultural reports came in from California's Central Valley. Crops were failing as temperatures dropped below growing ranges for desert-adapted plants. Citrus groves that had never seen frost were reporting widespread damage. Dairy farms were bringing cattle indoors for the first time in their operational history. The Colorado River's flow rate began changing too. Mountain snowpack was accumulating earlier and heavier than normal as the atmosphere cooled. Rivers that fed into our system were running colder and carrying different mineral content. I had to adjust our chemical treatment processes almost daily to account for the changing water chemistry. Jenkins stopped dismissing my concerns when the first infrastructure failures began. A pumping station outside Flagstaff seized up when water froze inside the impeller housing. A treatment plant in Tucson lost pressure when pipes cracked during an unexpected overnight freeze. These were facilities designed for desert operations, built with no consideration for sub-freezing temperatures. By Halloween, Las Vegas was seeing nighttime temperatures in the 40s. Phoenix was down to the 50s during the day. And still, the ash kept falling, lighter now but constant, like gray snow that never stopped. I could taste it in the air, feel it coating everything with a fine layer of volcanic grit. The power grid was straining under increased heating demands. Electric utilities across the Southwest were running at capacity as millions of people tried to heat homes that had been designed for cooling, not warming. Some residential areas were experiencing rolling blackouts to prevent total system failure. I started staying late at the dam, monitoring water temperatures and flow rates around the clock. The Colorado River was behaving like nothing I'd seen in 12 years of watching it. Ice was forming along the banks every night now, lasting longer into the day before melting. The water itself was carrying more sediment and debris as upstream freezing and thawing cycles destabilized riverbanks. Maria Santos called me on Halloween night with news that made my blood run cold. "Dante, we've lost 3 more pumping stations today. The water inside the pipes is freezing solid overnight, and when it expands, it's bursting the housings. We're looking at replacing equipment that was never designed to operate in these conditions." "How long can you keep operations running?" I asked her. "Maybe a month if temperatures stabilize. Maybe 2 weeks if they keep dropping. After that, we're looking at complete system failure for parts of Phoenix. People are going to have to evacuate or die of thirst." That's when I realized I wasn't just watching a weather event. I was watching the death of civilization as we knew it, one frozen pipe at a time. The ash clouds had created an artificial ice age, and the infrastructure that kept 40 million people alive simply wasn't built to handle it. I started making lists that night. every water source within 500 miles that might remain functional in sub-freezing temperatures. Natural springs that bubbled up from deep enough underground to stay liquid. Wells that tapped into geothermal. Aquifers, rivers fed by mountain snowmelt that would keep flowing even if surface water froze. I was creating a survival guide for the new world that was coming, whether anyone wanted to believe it or not. The next few weeks would test everything I thought I knew about water, survival, and human nature. As November approached and temperatures continued their relentless drop, I found myself becoming something I'd never expected to be. Not just an engineer managing water flow, but the keeper of knowledge that would determine who lived and who died in the frozen world that was taking shape around us. By the time the Colorado River began showing serious ice formation in early November, I understood that my real job was just beginning. The old world of routine maintenance and predictable systems was ending. The new world would require everything. I knew about water, and more courage than I'd ever needed before. November was when the dying started in earnest. The ash had been falling for 6 weeks straight, and temperatures across the Southwest had dropped another 15 degrees. What had started as an unusual cold snap was now clearly something much worse. Las Vegas hit 32 degrees on November 3rd, the first freezing temperature in the city's recorded weather history. Phoenix wasn't far behind at 38 degrees. These were desert cities that had never planned for winter, and it showed. The first deaths came from carbon monoxide poisoning. People were burning charcoal grills inside their homes, running car engines in closed garages, anything to generate heat in houses built for air conditioning, not heating. Emergency rooms were filling up with cases of smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide exposure. But the hospitals themselves were struggling with heating bills that had increased by 300% in a single month. I was monitoring these reports from inside Hoover Dam's control room, where the massive concrete structure provided some insulation against the dropping temperatures. The power plant generated its own heat as a byproduct of electricity production, making it one of the warmer places in the region. But even inside the dam, I could feel the cold creeping in through ventilation systems and maintenance tunnels. The Colorado River was telling me the real story of what was happening upstream. Water temperatures had dropped from their normal 65 degrees to 42 degrees, just 10 degrees above freezing. The flow rate was decreasing as tributary streams began icing over in Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. Mountain communities that fed snowmelt into our system were reporting ice formations they'd never seen before. Jenkins found me at the monitoring station on November 5th, studying flow data from our upstream sensors. Ripple, we're getting reports of ice formations at Glen Canyon Dam. Actual ice on the Colorado River in Utah. How is that even possible? I showed him the temperature readings I'd been tracking. The river's running 10 degrees colder than normal, and air temperatures upstream are hitting single digits at night. Glen Canyon's reservoir is larger and deeper than Lake Mead, so it'll take longer to freeze, but ice is starting to form along the edges. But rivers don't freeze in the Southwest, Jenkins said. This is desert country. We don't have winter infrastructure because we don't have winters. That was exactly the problem. The entire Colorado River system had been engineered for desert conditions. Pipes ran above ground or in shallow trenches. Pumping stations used equipment designed for temperatures that never dropped below 40 degrees. Water treatment plants relied on chemical processes that required specific temperature ranges. None of it was built for the ice age that was settling over us like a gray blanket. By mid-November, the infrastructure failures were cascading through the system. A major pumping station serving North Las Vegas failed when water froze inside the impeller housing, cracking the metal housing and flooding the pump room. The city had to shut off water service to 60,000 residents while crews attempted repairs with equipment that had never been tested in freezing conditions. Phoenix was experiencing similar failures. Maria Santos called me almost daily with updates that grew more desperate each time. "We've lost 8 pumping stations this week," she told me on November 15th. "Every time the temperature drops below freezing, we lose more equipment. The replacement parts we need don't exist because nobody ever planned for this. How many people are you serving now?" I asked her. "Maybe half the city, and that's only if temperatures don't drop any further. If we hit 20 degrees, we're looking at complete system failure. 2 million people without running water in the middle of winter." I was keeping detailed records of every failure, every workaround, every successful adaptation I heard about. My grandfather's survey maps were spread across my desk, and I was marking water sources that remained functional in red ink, failed systems in black ink. The pattern was becoming clear. Deeper wells and springs fed by geothermal aquifers were holding up. Surface water systems and shallow infrastructure were failing rapidly. The Hoover Dam crew was shrinking as workers left to check on their families or evacuate to warmer climates. By Thanksgiving, we were down from 47 people to 23. The facility was designed to operate with minimal staffing, but losing experienced operators meant longer shifts for those of us who remained. Marcus Webb left on November 20th to drive his family to his brother's place in Texas. "I'm sorry, Ripple," he told me. "I know you think we need to keep this place running, but my kids are more important than the power grid." I couldn't argue with him. The power grid was failing anyway. Rolling blackouts were hitting Las Vegas and Phoenix on a daily basis as heating demands exceeded generation capacity. Some residential areas had been without electricity for days at a time. People were burning furniture to stay warm, and smoke from thousands of improvised fires hung over the cities like fog. Sarah Martinez left the next day, headed for her sister's farm in New Mexico. "At least there they know how to live without electricity," she said. "These cities weren't built for survival, they were built for convenience." She was right. Cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix existed because of engineered systems that brought water from hundreds of miles away and electricity from massive power plants. Take away those systems, and the cities became death traps. Millions of people concentrated in desert locations with no local water sources and no experience living without modern utilities. Jenkins was struggling with the decision to stay or go. His wife had been calling daily, begging him to evacuate to her family in Colorado. But Colorado was seeing some of the worst conditions in the country, with temperatures dropping to 20 below zero, and snow accumulations that were burying entire towns. "Where do you go when everywhere is equally dangerous?" he asked me on November 25th. "At least here we have heat and running water. Out there, we'd be refugees competing with millions of other people for resources that don't exist." I was asking myself the same question. My apartment in Boulder City was getting harder to heat every day. The complex's heating system wasn't designed for temperatures below 50 degrees, and we were regularly seeing overnight lows in the 20s. But Hoover Dam remained warm and functional, one of the few pieces of critical infrastructure still operating normally. The decision was made for several crew members when the first blizzard hit on November 28th. 3 feet of snow fell in the mountains above Las Vegas, something that happened maybe once every 50 years under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. The storm system was fed by moisture from the Pacific Ocean interacting with the ash-cooled atmosphere, creating weather patterns that meteorologists couldn't predict. The snow shut down Interstate 15 between Las Vegas and Salt Lake City. Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque became impassable. People who might have evacuated to family in other states were now trapped wherever they happened to be when the storm hit. Tom Richardson tried to drive to his daughter's house in Denver on November 30th. His truck was found 3 days later buried in a snowdrift outside Beaver, Utah. He'd run out of gas trying to keep the engine running for heat. and had frozen to death less than a mile from a truck stop that had also been abandoned. Tom had worked at the dam for 15 years. He knew more about turbine maintenance than anyone else on the crew. By December 1st, we were down to 8 people. Me, Jenkins, 3 security guards, 2 maintenance techs, and 1 administrative assistant who refused to leave because her entire family lived in Boulder City and had nowhere else to go. The facility felt like a ghost town, with most of the offices dark and only essential systems still being monitored. That's when the radio calls started coming in. Amateur radio operators across the Southwest had organized an emergency network, and word was spreading that Hoover Dam was still operational. People were calling for information about water sources, power restoration, evacuation routes, anything that might help them survive. The first call I answered was from a man in Kingman, Arizona. "Is this really Hoover Dam? Are you guys still running? We haven't had electricity for 4 days, and the water stopped flowing yesterday." I confirmed that we were still generating power, but explained that local distribution systems were failing due to the cold. "Your power company's transmission lines are probably damaged by ice accumulation," I told him. "And if your water stopped flowing, it means pipes have frozen and burst somewhere in the system." "How long is this going to last?" he asked. "When do temperatures go back to normal?" That was the question everyone was asking, and I didn't want to give him the answer I suspected was true. The ash clouds showed no signs of dissipating. Satellite imagery revealed volcanic debris spreading through the upper atmosphere at altitudes where it could remain suspended for months or years. This wasn't a temporary weather event. This was climate change happening in real time. More calls followed. A woman in Barstow whose neighborhood had been without water for a week. A man in St. George reporting that half the city was dark and emergency services had stopped responding to calls. A family in Bullhead City asking if it was safe to drink water from the Colorado River directly, since their treatment plant had shut down. I started keeping a log of these calls, noting locations where infrastructure was still functional and places where complete system failure had occurred. The pattern was clear. Smaller communities with simpler infrastructure were adapting better than large cities with complex interdependent systems. Places that relied on local wells and septic systems were functioning better than places connected to regional water treatment networks. By December 10th, I was spending more time on the radio than monitoring dam operations. Jenkins was handling most of the routine maintenance while I became an unofficial information clearinghouse for survivors across the region. People were calling me the water guy, and my reputation was spreading through the amateur radio network faster than I'd expected. The calls were getting more desperate. A group in Henderson reported that their neighborhood was down to melting snow for drinking water, but they didn't know how to purify it safely. I walked them through basic boiling and filtration techniques using materials they could find in abandoned stores. Another caller from Lake Havasu City told me their community had found a natural hot spring, but the water tasted strongly of sulfur, and they were afraid it might be poisonous. I explained how to test water pH using simple indicators and how to build a basic filtration system using sand and charcoal. But the hardest call came from a woman in Needles, California. Her voice was shaking as she described watching her elderly neighbor die from dehydration because the local hospital had no running water and no way to provide intravenous fluids. "How many more people are going to die?" she asked me. "How many more?" I couldn't answer her question because I didn't want to tell her what my calculations were showing. At current failure rates, major water systems serving Phoenix and Las Vegas would be completely offline within 2 months. That meant 2.5 million people would be without reliable access to clean water in the middle of winter. The logistics of evacuating that many people were impossible. Most would have to find local sources of water or die. The Colorado River itself was starting to show the effects I'd been predicting since October. Ice was forming along the banks of Lake Mead every night, extending further from shore each day. The water temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, just 6 degrees above freezing. Glen Canyon Dam was reporting similar conditions, with ice formations thick enough to affect boat navigation. On December 15th, I witnessed something I'd never thought I'd see. A thin sheet of ice formed across a small bay on the Nevada side of Lake Mead. It was only a few inches thick and melted by midday, but it was ice forming on water that had never frozen in recorded history. I took photos to document it, understanding that I might be witnessing the beginning of something unprecedented. Jenkins found me at the observation deck that evening, looking out at the lake where patches of slush were forming as temperatures dropped toward 20 degrees. "Ripple, I need to ask you something, and I want you to give me an honest answer. Do you think the Colorado River is going to freeze completely?" I'd been running calculations on that exact scenario for weeks. If temperatures drop another 10 degrees and stay there for more than a few days, yes, the river will freeze solid from Glen Canyon to the Gulf of California. And when that happens, the water supply for 40 million people disappears overnight. How long before that happens? Maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month. But it's going to happen, Jenkins. The only question is whether enough people understand what's coming to prepare for it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the conversations I'd had with survivors, all the communities that were struggling to adapt to conditions their infrastructure couldn't handle. I was becoming the memory keeper of how the old systems worked, and the advisor for how new systems might work in a frozen world. But I was also becoming a target. Every piece of information I shared over the radio waves was being heard by desperate people who might decide that controlling me was more valuable than cooperating with me. Knowledge about water sources and infrastructure was becoming the most valuable currency in the new world, and I was rapidly becoming the richest man in a very poor land. The temperature hit 18 degrees on December 20th, and I watched ice form across another section of Lake Mead, this time staying frozen until nearly noon the next day. The Colorado River was sending me a message I could no longer ignore. Winter was coming to the desert, and it was bringing changes that would reshape everything we thought we knew about survival in the American Southwest. As Christmas approached, I found myself preparing for possibilities I'd never imagined. The old world was ending one frozen pipe at a time, and I was becoming something I'd never expected to be. Not just an engineer managing routine operations, but the keeper of knowledge that would determine how civilization rebuilt itself in the ice age that was settling over us like a gray shroud. January 15th was when the government officially gave up on us. The last scheduled supply drop to Hoover Dam never arrived, and radio contact with federal agencies went completely silent. We'd been expecting a delivery of heating oil, emergency rations, and replacement parts for equipment that was failing in the cold. Instead, we got nothing but static on the emergency frequencies and the realization that we were truly on our own. By then, it was just me and 3 security guards left at the facility. Jenkins had finally given in to his wife's pleas and driven to Colorado the week before, though I doubted he'd made it through the mountain passes that were buried under 8 feet of snow. The temperature had stabilized at a bone-chilling 15 degrees during the day, dropping to 5 below zero at night. These were temperatures that the Southwest had never seen in recorded history. The 3 guards who remained were an interesting group, each with their own reasons for staying when everyone else had fled. Martinez was former Border Patrol, a man in his 50s who'd spent decades dealing with desert survival situations. His family was in Tucson, but he'd received word that the entire southern Arizona region was without power or water. "At least here we've got heat and food," he told me. "Out there, I'd just be another refugee." Chun was the youngest of us, a recent college graduate who'd been working security for less than a year. His girlfriend had been visiting Las Vegas when the first blizzards hit, and he'd lost contact with her when the cell towers went down. He was convinced she was still alive somewhere in the city, and leaving the dam meant abandoning any hope of finding her. Washington was the veteran. Among us, a 20-year dam employee who'd worked his way up from maintenance to security supervisor. His children had been evacuated to Denver in November, but he'd stayed behind to maintain essential systems. "Somebody's got to keep the lights on," he said. "If this place goes dark, half the Southwest loses power completely." We were surviving on emergency MREs and melted lake ice, living in the power plant control room because it was the only space we could keep above freezing. The massive generators produced enough waste heat to maintain a temperature around 45 degrees, which felt tropical compared to the conditions outside. We'd moved sleeping bags and personal belongings into the control room, turning the nerve center of America's most famous dam into our survival bunker. The radio calls were becoming constant. Word had spread through the amateur radio networks that Hoover Dam was still operational and that I was providing water location advice to survivors. My call sign had become known across the Southwest as the voice of someone who understood how infrastructure worked and where resources might still be found. The calls came from everywhere. Phoenix, where Maria Santos reported that city water service had failed completely on January 8th. "We're down to emergency wells and bottled water distribution," she told me during one of our regular check-ins. "Maybe 2 weeks of supplies left and no way to get more. The treatment plants are frozen solid and we can't get replacement parts because the supply chains have collapsed." Las Vegas was in even worse shape. A ham radio operator calling himself Desert Fox reported that most of the city was dark and emergency services had stopped functioning. "The fire department ran out of fuel last week," he said. "Police stopped patrolling when their vehicles wouldn't start in the cold. It's every neighborhood for itself now." But the most disturbing calls came from smaller communities that had been completely cut off. A woman in Laughlin, Nevada told me that their town of 8,000 people was down to fewer than 300 survivors. The rest either froze to death or tried to walk out through the desert, she said. "We found some of them in the spring. They didn't make it very far." I was keeping detailed maps of which communities were still functional and which had been abandoned. The pattern was becoming clear. Places with local water sources and simple infrastructure were surviving. Communities that depended on complex regional systems were dying. It was a harsh lesson in the difference between resilience and efficiency. Every conversation I had over the radio was being monitored by dozens of other survivors. Information about water sources, food caches, and functioning infrastructure was being shared, hoarded, and sometimes fought over. I started to realize that my knowledge was making me valuable in ways that could be dangerous. The first direct threat came on January 20th. A group calling themselves the Vegas Collective had apparently organized survivors from the Las Vegas area into some kind of paramilitary organization. Their radio operator, who called himself Colonel Davis, contacted me directly. "Water guy, this is Colonel Davis with the Vegas Collective. We've got 1,500 people under our protection, and we need reliable information about water sources in the region. We're prepared to offer you security and supplies in exchange for exclusive access to your knowledge." The way he said exclusive access made my skin crawl. These weren't people looking for cooperation. They were looking to control information and use it as leverage over other survivor groups. I'd heard enough military terminology in my years working with federal agencies to recognize when someone was trying to recruit me versus when they were trying to own me. "I appreciate the offer," I told him, "but I'm providing information to anyone who needs it. Water doesn't belong to any one group." His response was immediate and threatening. "That's a mistake, water guy. In the new world, resources belong to whoever can protect them. You can either work with us voluntarily, or we can arrange a different kind of conversation." I switched off the radio and looked at Martinez, who'd been listening to the exchange. How many people do you think he really represents? I asked. Maybe 50, maybe 100, Martinez said. These militia types always inflate their numbers. But even 50 armed people could be a problem if they decide to come looking for you. That conversation changed everything. I wasn't just providing helpful information to desperate survivors anymore. I was becoming a strategic asset that different groups might try to capture or control. Every piece of advice I gave over the radio was being evaluated, not just for its survival value, but for its tactical importance. I started receiving similar offers from other organized groups. A coalition in Phoenix wanted me to relocate there and help them establish water security for their community. A group of farmers in Imperial Valley, California, offered me land and protection in exchange for helping them design irrigation systems that could function in freezing temperatures. But the most interesting offer came from an unexpected source. A woman calling herself Professor Williams contacted me on January 25th, claiming to represent faculty and students from the University of Nevada who had established a survivor community in the mountains outside Reno. "We're not interested in controlling you," she told me. "We're interested in preserving knowledge. What you understand about water infrastructure is going to be crucial for rebuilding civilization when this crisis passes. We'd like to work with you to document that knowledge and teach it to others." Her approach was different from the militaristic demands I'd been hearing from other groups. She was thinking about long-term survival and rebuilding rather than short-term resource control. But even her offer raised uncomfortable questions about what my role should be in whatever came next. The radio conversations were revealing how quickly social structures were changing. Communities that had survived were organizing themselves in ways that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Some had elected councils that made decisions by consensus. Others had strongmen who ruled through control of resources or weapons. A few had established barter economies where technical knowledge was traded like currency. I was becoming a professor of post-apocalyptic hydrology without ever intending to take the job. People called me for advice about everything from purifying contaminated water to building simple pumping systems using car parts. I walked communities through constructing solar stills, digging wells by hand, and identifying which natural water sources were safe to drink from. One of the most memorable calls came from a group in Flagstaff that had discovered a natural hot spring, but were afraid the water might be contaminated. I spent an hour teaching them how to test water quality using basic chemistry and how to build filtration systems using materials they could scavenge from abandoned buildings. Another caller from Yuma, Arizona, had found a way to keep their community's water flowing by running pipes through buildings that were still heated. It was an ingenious adaptation that I started recommending to other communities facing similar challenges. But for every success story, there were reports of failure and tragedy. A community in Needles had tried to implement one of my suggestions for treating contaminated river water, but they'd made mistakes in the process and several people had gotten sick. The guilt of knowing that my advice might have contributed to someone's suffering was becoming a constant weight. Shun found me in the control room on January 30th, staring at maps covered with red and black marks indicating functional and failed water systems. "You're carrying the weight of the world, aren't you?" he said. "Every decision I make affects people's lives," I told him. "Every piece of information I share could save a community or get people killed if they implement it wrong. How do you make those kinds of choices?" "You do the best you can with the information you have," he said. "That's all anyone can do." But I was starting to understand that good intentions weren't enough. The knowledge I possessed about water infrastructure wasn't just helpful information anymore. It was power, and power attracted people who wanted to use it for their own purposes. The threats were becoming more specific. Colonel Davis and his Vegas collective had apparently sent scouts to locate Hoover Dam, and Washington reported seeing vehicle tracks in the snow around the perimeter. We started posting watches. and keeping weapons ready, understanding that our isolation might not protect us much longer. Martinez suggested that we might need to consider relocating. "This place is too visible," he said. "Everyone knows where Hoover Dam is located. If enough people decide they want to control you, we can't defend this facility with 4 people." But leaving the dam meant abandoning the infrastructure that was keeping us alive. The power plant provided heat, electricity, and communications. Equipment. The facility had stockpiles of food and supplies that would last for months. Most importantly, it had access to unlimited fresh water from Lake Mead, even though parts of the lake were now covered with ice. I was also reluctant to leave because I'd become the unofficial guardian of critical infrastructure knowledge. The technical manuals, engineering drawings, and operational procedures stored at Hoover Dam represented decades of accumulated expertise about water management. If this facility was abandoned or destroyed, that knowledge might be lost forever. By early February, I was receiving radio calls from survivor communities as far away as San Diego and Salt Lake City. My reputation as the water guy had spread beyond the immediate Southwest, and people were traveling hundreds of miles just to speak with someone who understood how infrastructure systems worked. Some of these long-distance callers were asking questions that went far beyond basic survival. They wanted to know how to rebuild water treatment systems from scratch, how to design distribution networks for new communities, and how to maintain complex equipment without access to modern supply chains. I realized I was becoming something unprecedented. Not just a survivor sharing helpful tips, but the keeper of civilization's institutional memory about water infrastructure. In a world where most technical experts had either died or fled to supposedly safer locations, I was one of the few people left who understood how the systems that supported modern life actually functioned. The weight of that responsibility was becoming overwhelming. Every conversation felt like a final exam where wrong answers could lead to real deaths. Communities were making life or death decisions based on my recommendations, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being asked to play God with people's survival. Washington found me in the control room at 2 a.m. on February 10th, unable to sleep and reviewing water quality reports from the few monitoring stations that were still functioning. "You know this can't last forever," he said. "Eventually, you're going to have to choose between staying here and helping people, or leaving here and staying alive." He was right. The radio traffic was making it clear that multiple groups were actively searching for my location. Some wanted to recruit me, others wanted to control me, and a few seemed to want to eliminate me as a threat to their own power structures. Knowledge about water infrastructure was becoming the most valuable commodity in the frozen world, and I was the richest man in a very dangerous market. The Colorado River was telling its own story about the changes that were still coming. Ice now covered more than half of Lake Mead's surface, and the river downstream was running at less than 20% of normal flow. Communities that depended on Colorado River water were facing complete system failure within weeks, not months. As February progressed and temperatures remained locked in the single digits, I understood that I was approaching a decision point. I could stay at Hoover Dam and continue providing information to anyone who asked, knowing that it made me a target for groups that wanted to control that information. Or I could disappear into the frozen wasteland with the most valuable knowledge. In the New World, becoming a ghost who helped communities from the shadows. The choice I made would determine not just my own survival, but the survival of countless communities that had come to depend on the voice of the water guy coming through their radios in the dark hours of the night. And time was running out to make that choice, because the footprints in the snow around the dam were getting closer every day. February taught me that knowledge can be the heaviest burden of all. The ash was still falling, lighter now but constant, coating everything with a fine gray dust that reminded us daily that the world had fundamentally changed. Temperatures had stabilized in the deadly range, 5 below zero at night and barely reaching 10 degrees during the day. The 3 security guards had finally left the week before, each making their own difficult choice about where they had the best chance of survival. Martinez left first on February 3rd, heading south toward his family in Tucson. "I've gotten word that some communities down there are holding together," he told me as he loaded his truck with supplies. "My daughters got 3 kids, and they need their grandfather more than you need another guard." I understood his choice, but watching him drive away left me feeling more isolated than I'd expected. Chun followed 2 days later, still convinced his girlfriend was alive somewhere in Las Vegas. "I can't keep waiting for her to contact me," he said. "If she's out there, I need to find her before it's too late." He took one of the facility's snowmobiles and enough supplies for a week, promising to return if he found no trace of her. I never heard from him again. Washington was the last to go, and his departure hit me the hardest. He'd been at Hoover Dam for 20 years, longer than anyone else who'd remained through the crisis. "My kids are in Denver," he finally told me on February 8th. "I've gotten radio contact with a group there that says the city's organized survival communities. They need people with infrastructure experience, and I need to know my children are safe." By February 10th, I was completely alone in a facility designed for 50 people. The isolation was profound in ways I hadn't anticipated. The constant hum of the generators and the endless radio chatter from desperate survivors became the only sounds breaking the silence. I found myself talking to the equipment, narrating my daily routines just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. But the radio calls kept coming, more desperate than ever. Phoenix had officially declared emergency water rationing on February 1st, limiting residents to 2 gallons per person per day from emergency distribution points. Maria Santos called me every few days with updates that grew grimmer each time. "We're down to maybe 10 days of reserves," she told me on February 12th. "After that, people are going to have to find their own water sources or leave the city." "How many people are still there?" I asked her. "Maybe 800,000, down from 1.7 million. Most left in January when it became clear the infrastructure wasn't coming back online. But 800,000 people is still more than we can support with emergency measures." The mathematics of survival were becoming stark. Major cities couldn't sustain their populations without the complex infrastructure that had failed in the cold. People had to either evacuate to areas with simpler, more resilient systems, or they had to die. There was no middle ground when temperatures stayed below freezing for months. Las Vegas was experiencing similar collapse. Desert Fox, the ham radio operator who'd become my regular contact there, reported that the city was essentially abandoned, except for organized survivor communities that had fortified specific neighborhoods. Maybe 50,000 people left. "In a city built for 2 million, he told me. "Most of the suburbs are ghost towns now. We're seeing scavenger groups moving through empty neighborhoods, taking anything useful before winter weather destroys it completely." The most heartbreaking calls came from smaller communities that had been completely isolated. A woman in Laughlin updated me on their situation every week, and the news was never good. They'd started with 300 survivors in January. By mid-February, they were down to fewer than 100. "People keep trying to walk out," she told me. "They think they can make it to larger communities where there might be more resources. But it's 40 miles to the nearest town through desert that's now covered with snow. We find the bodies in spring when the snow melts." I was keeping detailed records of every community I had contact with, tracking which ones were surviving and which ones were failing. The patterns were becoming clear, but they weren't encouraging. Communities with local water sources, simple infrastructure, and strong social organization were adapting. Everyone else was either dying in place or becoming refugees in a world with no safe destination. My maps were covered with marks indicating the status of different settlements. Red marks for communities that were thriving, yellow for those struggling but surviving, black for those that had gone silent. The black marks were multiplying faster than the red ones, and entire regions of the Southwest were becoming dead zones where no human voices answered radio calls. The knowledge I possessed about water infrastructure was becoming more valuable and more dangerous every day. Groups that had organized survivor communities were actively seeking me out, and their approaches were becoming more sophisticated and more threatening. The Vegas Collective had apparently hired or recruited people with military experience. Colonel Davis contacted me again on February 15th with what he called a final offer. His tone had changed from recruiting to demanding. "Water guy, we've confirmed your location, and we're prepared to extract you for your own protection. The knowledge you possess is too valuable to risk losing to raiders or natural disasters. You'll have a comfortable position with our organization, and your expertise will be used to benefit the largest survivor community in Nevada." The word extract told me everything I needed to know about their intentions. They weren't offering partnership. They were planning kidnapping with a friendly label attached. I'd heard enough military terminology to understand that for your own protection usually meant whether you want it or not. "I appreciate your concern," I told him, "but I'm secure where I am and I prefer to remain independent." His response was immediate and chilling. "Independence isn't an option anymore, water guy. You're either with an organized group that can protect you, or you're prey for groups that want to use you. We'll be in touch soon about arranging your relocation." I switched off the radio and spent the next hour checking the facility's security measures. Hoover Dam was built like a fortress, with limited access points and excellent sight lines for spotting approaching vehicles. But it was also a highly visible target that couldn't be hidden or moved. If enough people decided they wanted to control me, the dam's isolation would become a trap rather than protection. The threats weren't just coming from paramilitarized groups. A coalition calling itself the Phoenix Alliance had taken a different approach, sending a woman named Dr. Rebecca Torres to negotiate with me over the radio. She claimed to represent medical professionals and engineers who were trying to rebuild infrastructure in the Phoenix area. "Mr. Vasquez, we understand you value your independence, but we believe your knowledge could save thousands of lives if applied systematically to rebuilding efforts. We're not talking about kidnapping or coercion. We're talking about voluntary collaboration with people who share your commitment to helping survivors." Her approach was more sophisticated than Colonel Davis's threats, but the underlying message was the same. They wanted exclusive access to my knowledge, and they weren't planning to take no for an answer. "We're prepared to guarantee your safety and autonomy," she continued, "but we need assurance that you'll prioritize communities that can make the most effective use of infrastructure improvements." "You're asking me to choose which communities live and which die," I told her. "We're asking you to recognize that resources are limited and that strategic thinking can multiply the impact of your expertise. A water system that serves 10,000 people is more valuable than one that serves 100 people." She was right in practical terms, but her logic led to dark places. If I started making decisions based on efficiency rather than need, I'd become exactly what I'd been trying to avoid: someone who used control of water information to exercise power over life and death. The most disturbing contact came from a group that didn't identify themselves at all. The voice was electronically distorted, making it impossible to determine gender or age. "Water guy, your broadcasts are interfering with resource allocation in our territory. Communities that should be relocating to sustainable locations are staying put because they believe your advice will save them. This is creating inefficient distribution of survivor populations. People have the right to make their own decisions about where to live," I told them. "Rights are a luxury that no longer exists. Resource management requires central coordination." You will either coordinate with authorized allocation authorities, or your broadcasts will be terminated. The clinical language was more frightening than direct threats. These people talked about human communities like they were managing inventory. And they clearly had both the resources and the ruthlessness to back up their ultimatums. I started varying my radio schedule and using different frequencies to make it harder for hostile groups to track my transmissions. But I also understood that my isolation was becoming untenable. Sooner or later, one of these groups would make good on their threats, and I'd have to choose between capitulation and flight. The technical challenges were becoming more complex too. Communities that had survived the initial infrastructure failures were now dealing with second-order problems that required more sophisticated solutions. A group in Barstow had managed to keep water flowing by running pipes through heated buildings, but now they needed advice on preventing bacterial contamination in a system that wasn't designed for the materials they were using. Another community in St. George had found a way to generate electricity using a small stream, but they needed guidance on building distribution systems that could handle the irregular power output. These weren't simple survival questions anymore. These were engineering problems that required deep technical knowledge and careful analysis. I was becoming a one-man university for post-apocalyptic infrastructure, teaching courses in hydrology, electrical engineering, and systems management to students I'd never meet. The responsibility was overwhelming, especially when I knew that wrong answers could lead to system failures that would kill entire communities. The guilt was constant. A community in Cedar City had tried to implement one of my recommendations for treating contaminated well water, but they'd misunderstood the chemical ratios and several people had gotten sick. When they called for help, I spent hours walking them through emergency treatment procedures and revised filtration methods, knowing that my initial advice had contributed to their crisis. Another group in Yuma had successfully implemented a pump solar still design I'd described, but then they'd tried to scale it up without understanding the engineering principles involved. Their expanded system had failed catastrophically, leaving them without water purification capability just when they needed it most. Each failure taught me that good intentions weren't enough. The knowledge I was sharing had to be foolproof, idiot-resistant, and implementable by people who might not have technical backgrounds or proper materials. I started developing simplified procedures and backup methods for every recommendation I made, but the complexity was becoming unmanageable. By late February, I was spending 18 hours a day on the radio, answering questions that ranged from basic water safety to complex engineering problems. I was creating technical drawings by hand and describing them over radio waves to people who were trying to build life-saving systems using scavenged materials and improvised tools. The isolation was taking its toll in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself talking to my grandfather's maps as if they were conversation partners, describing the communities I was helping and asking for advice about decisions that felt too large for one person to make. The constant responsibility for other people's survival was wearing me down mentally and emotionally. But I also understood that I was becoming something unprecedented in human history. I was the keeper of civilization's memory about water infrastructure. In a world where most of that knowledge had been lost with the collapse of institutions and the death or displacement of technical experts, the procedures, calculations, and problem-solving methods that I carried in my head might be the only thing standing between human survival and complete civilizational collapse. The radio calls were coming from further away now, as word of the water guys spread beyond the Southwest. A group in Denver had contacted me for advice about preventing pipes from freezing in buildings that couldn't be heated. Communities in Northern California were asking about earthquake-resistant water systems. Even survivors in Texas were calling for guidance about purifying water that had been contaminated by failed industrial facilities. I was accidentally becoming the technical consultant for the reconstruction of American civilization, one radio call at a time. The scope was far beyond what any individual could handle, but there was no one else filling that role. The federal government had ceased to function in any meaningful way. State and local governments had collapsed along with the infrastructure they depended on. Technical expertise was becoming a rare and precious resource that communities were willing to fight for. As February ended and March approached, I understood that my situation was becoming unsustainable. The threats were escalating, the isolation was becoming dangerous, and the demands on my time and knowledge were growing beyond my ability to manage. I had to make a choice about what role I wanted to play in whatever came next, and I had to make it soon. The footprints in the snow around Hoover Dam were getting closer every day, and the radio traffic was making it clear that multiple groups were actively searching for my exact location. Time was running out to decide whether I wanted to become a prize to be captured and controlled, or disappear into the frozen wasteland with the most valuable knowledge in the new world. March 10th was the day I abandoned the last symbol of the old world's power. I stood in the control room of Hoover Dam for the final time, looking at the banks of monitors that had been my window into the Colorado River system for 6 months of isolation and crisis. The generators were still running, still producing electricity. That flowed to communities hundreds of miles away, but I knew my time as their guardian was over. The decision had been made for me 3 days earlier when I'd spotted armed vehicles conducting reconnaissance around the dam's perimeter. Colonel Davis and his Vegas collective had moved from threats to action, and my isolation had become a death trap. Through binoculars, I'd watched teams of men mapping approach routes and establishing observation posts in the hills overlooking the facility. They were planning an assault, not a negotiation. I spent those final days at the dam creating what I called my insurance policy. Using the facility's resources, I copied every technical manual, engineering drawing, and operational procedure that might be useful for rebuilding water infrastructure. I burned the information onto dozens of data storage devices and created multiple hard copy sets of the most critical documents. If something happened to me, at least the knowledge wouldn't die with me. My truck was loaded with everything I could carry. Water purification equipment that I'd modified for portable use. Testing kits that could identify contamination in any water source. Hand tools designed for repairing pumps and valves under field conditions. Most importantly, I carried my grandfather's survey maps, now marked with 6 months of updates about which water sources remained functional and which communities had survived. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the radio. For months, that equipment had been my lifeline to the survivor communities scattered across the frozen Southwest. I'd become the voice they turned to in crisis, the person who understood how the old systems worked and how new ones might be built. Leaving the dam meant abandoning the high-powered transmitters that had made those conversations possible. But I couldn't stay. The footprints in the snow were getting closer every day, and radio intercepts had revealed that at least 3 different groups were actively hunting for my location. The Vegas collective wanted to control me. The Phoenix Alliance wanted to recruit me. And that unidentified group with the electronically distorted voices wanted to eliminate me as a threat to their resource management strategy. I left Hoover Dam at dawn on March 10th, driving south through frozen desert that looked like an alien landscape. The Colorado River below the dam was completely frozen solid, a fact that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Ice stretched from bank to bank, thick enough to walk on, transforming the lifeline of the Southwest into a crystalline highway that led nowhere. My first stop was a supply cache I'd established near Laughlin, Nevada. During my final weeks at the dam, I'd made several trips to hide equipment and resources in locations that only I knew about. The strategy was simple. If I was going to be mobile, I needed supply points that would allow me to operate independently, without relying on any single community for support. The cache was hidden in an abandoned gas station off Highway 95, buried under debris in a way that looked natural, but would be recognizable to me. Inside waterproof containers, I'd stored additional purification tablets, backup testing equipment, extra copies of technical documents, and enough food to last 2 weeks. If hostile groups captured one cache, I'd have others to fall back on. But the cache had been disturbed. The containers were still there, but someone had clearly been through the area recently. Fresh tire tracks in the snow led to and from the hiding spot, and the arrangement of debris wasn't quite the way I'd left it. Someone was tracking my movements more carefully than I'd realized. I loaded what I needed and moved on quickly, understanding that my pursuers were closer than I'd hoped. The radio in my truck crackled with familiar voices as I drove. Desert Fox from Las Vegas was calling for the water guy, reporting that his community had lost another well to freezing overnight. Maria Santos from Phoenix was trying to reach me with updates about their dwindling water reserves. I wanted to answer them, but using the radio would reveal my location to anyone monitoring the frequencies. Instead, I listened to their calls. With growing frustration, knowing that people needed my help but unable to provide it without endangering myself, and ultimately endangering them too. My destination was a community I'd been advising for weeks but had never visited. The Phoenix group led by Dr. Rebecca Torres had established a survivor settlement in the mountains north of the city, in an area with natural springs and defensible terrain. They'd been implementing my recommendations for water system design, and I wanted to see firsthand how well my remote consulting was working. But I also had ulterior motives. If I was going to continue helping communities, I needed to understand how to do it safely. Working through intermediaries might allow me to share knowledge without becoming a target for groups that wanted to control that knowledge. The drive to Phoenix took 12 hours through roads that were barely passable. Ice and snow had damaged pavement surfaces that were never designed for freezing temperatures. Abandoned vehicles littered the highway, some from accidents, others simply broken down when their owners ran out of fuel or when mechanical systems failed in the cold. The most disturbing sights were the emergency camps that had been established along major evacuation routes. These were places where refugees from Las Vegas and Phoenix had gathered, hoping to find safety in numbers or waiting for government assistance that never came. Now they were frozen monuments to failed hopes, collections of tents and improvised shelters that had become tombs when temperatures dropped below survival levels. I stopped at one of these camps near Wickenburg, Arizona, hoping to find survivors who might need immediate assistance. But the site was completely silent, buried under 3 feet of snow that had accumulated over weeks of abandonment. I used a shovel to clear snow from several shelters, but found only bodies of people who had died from exposure or starvation. The scene reinforced what I'd learned from radio conversations over the past months. Mobility without destination was usually suicide in the New World. People who fled their homes without specific plans and resources rarely survived long enough to find safety elsewhere. The communities that were thriving were those that had adapted in place or had organized migrations to predetermined locations. With known resources, I reached the Phoenix Group's mountain settlement on March 12th. After spending a night camped in my truck at a rest area that provided some shelter from the wind. The community had chosen their location well. Natural hot springs provided both water and heat, while the mountainous terrain offered multiple defensive positions and clear sight lines for spotting approaching threats. Dr. Torres met me at their perimeter checkpoint, and I was impressed by the organization they'd established. Guards were posted at strategic locations, but they were clearly community members taking turns at security duties rather than professional soldiers. The settlement had the feel of a college town that had been transformed for survival rather than a military compound. "Mr. Vasquez, we're honored that you decided to visit us," Dr. Torres said as she led me through the settlement. "Your advice about spring development and water distribution has been invaluable. We're supporting nearly 200 people now, and the systems are working exactly as you described." The water infrastructure they'd built, based on my radio consultations, was impressive. They'd tap the natural springs using techniques I described for maximizing flow while preventing contamination. Distribution pipes were buried deep enough to prevent freezing, and they'd installed backup systems that could maintain water flow even if primary pumps failed. But what impressed me most was how they'd adapted my technical recommendations to their specific situation. The community included several engineering professors from Arizona State University, and they'd refined my basic designs with improvements I hadn't considered. They were thinking systematically about long-term sustainability rather than just short-term survival. "We've been hoping you'd consider staying with us," Dr. Torres said as we toured their workshop facilities. "Your knowledge combined with our academic resources could help us develop solutions that we could share with other communities. Instead of consulting remotely, you could work directly with people who understand the technical principles behind your recommendations." It was a tempting offer. The community had resources, security, and people who could implement complex projects without constant supervision. But it also represented exactly the kind of exclusive arrangement that I'd been trying to avoid. If I affiliated with one community, even a well-intentioned one, I'd be abandoning my independence and my ability to help anyone who needed assistance. "I appreciate the offer," I told her, "but I've seen what happens when technical knowledge becomes concentrated in one location. If something happens to this community, or if you decide to use that knowledge for competitive advantage rather than mutual aid, then everyone else suffers." She nodded thoughtfully. "We understand your concerns. But we've been thinking about this differently. What if we created a network of communities that shared technical knowledge and resources? Instead of hoarding expertise, we could develop a system for distributing it safely and effectively." The concept was intriguing, but I'd heard similar proposals from other groups. Everyone had plans for cooperation until resources became scarce or conflicts arose. The Vegas Collective had probably started with good intentions too, before they'd decided that controlling resources was more important than sharing them. I spent 3 days with the Phoenix Mountain community, learning from their innovations and sharing additional techniques that might improve their systems. But I also noticed things that concerned me. Guards were becoming more military in their attitudes. Discussions about resource allocation were becoming more heated. Even this well-intentioned community was showing signs of the territorial thinking that had consumed other survivor groups. On my last night there, Dr. Torres approached me with a different kind of proposal. "We've been monitoring radio traffic, and we know that multiple groups are actively hunting for you. The Vegas Collective has put a bounty on information about your location. That unidentified group has been jamming communications in areas where they think you might be operating. You can't stay mobile indefinitely. What are you suggesting?" I asked. "We help you disappear completely. New identity, different appearance, relocation to a community where no one knows who you are. You could continue helping people, but without the target on your back that comes with being the famous water guy." It was a generous offer, but it would require giving up everything that had made me effective. My reputation, my radio contacts, my established relationships with communities across the region. I'd become just another refugee with technical skills, valuable but not irreplaceable. I left the mountain community on March 15th without giving Dr. Torres a final answer, but with a new understanding of my situation. Every group that wanted to help me was also trying to control me, even if their intentions were good. True independence meant accepting that I'd always be hunted by someone who wanted to use my knowledge for their own purposes. My next stop was a much smaller community near Flagstaff that had been implementing my recommendations for cold weather water system modifications. They'd managed to keep their municipal water system partially functional by using techniques I'd described for preventing pipes from freezing and maintaining pump operations in sub-zero temperatures. The difference between this community and the Phoenix Mountain Group was striking. Where the Phoenix settlement felt like an academic exercise, In sustainable living, Flagstaff felt like a desperate improvisation that was barely holding together. But they'd also adapted my recommendations in creative ways that showed real understanding of the underlying principles. "Water guy, you saved our lives," said Tom Morrison, the former city engineer who'd become their unofficial infrastructure manager. "The pipe heating system you described has kept water flowing to 800 people through the worst winter in recorded history. Without that advice, we'd have lost half our population to dehydration." But Tom also shared troubling news. "We've been hearing radio chatter about organized groups that are mapping functional communities and cataloging their resources. Someone's creating a database of which places have survived and what they have to offer. It feels like preparation for some kind of coordinated takeover." The pattern was becoming clear. The initial chaos of infrastructure collapse was giving way to more organized efforts to control resources and populations. Warlords and would-be governments were emerging from the ruins of the old system, and they were competing for control over the survivors and the knowledge needed to rebuild. I spent 2 weeks moving between smaller communities, always staying ahead of the search parties that I knew were tracking me. Each stop taught me more about how my remote consulting was working in practice, and each community showed me different adaptations of the techniques I'd shared over the radio. Some implementations were brilliant. A group near Sedona had used my spring development techniques to create a water system that supported 3 times the population I'd thought possible. Others were disasters. A community near Sholo had tried to scale up a purification system without understanding the chemistry involved, and they'd contaminated their only reliable water source. The successes and failures were teaching me that knowledge transfer wasn't just about sharing information. It was about understanding how different communities would interpret and implement that information based on their resources, skills, and social dynamics. What worked for a group of engineering professors might fail catastrophically when attempted by desperate refugees with limited technical background. By early April, I'd established a circuit of communities that I visited regularly, always moving, never staying long enough for hostile groups to track me down. I was becoming a traveling professor of post-apocalyptic infrastructure, teaching hands-on workshops in water system design, maintenance, and repair. The work was more effective than my radio consulting had been, but it was also more dangerous. Every community I helped became a potential source of information for groups that wanted to find me. Every person I taught became someone who might be interrogated or tortured for details about my location and plans. But I was also learning that my knowledge was spreading beyond anything I could have achieved working alone. The communities I helped were teaching other communities. Techniques I'd developed were being shared through informal networks that connected survivor settlements across the region. The ripple effect that had given me my nickname was working on a scale I'd never imagined. The Ice Age had made me something I'd never expected to be. Not just a survivor, but the keeper of knowledge that would determine which parts of human civilization would live on and which would be buried forever under the ice. My journey was just beginning, and every mile ahead would test whether I could use this terrible gift to rebuild the world, or watch it freeze to death one community at a time. The Colorado River was still frozen solid as I drove past it on my way to check on a community near Lake Havasu City. The sight reminded me of everything that had changed and everything that was still changing. The old world of predictable systems and reliable infrastructure was gone forever. The new world would be built by people who understood that survival required cooperation, adaptation, and the wisdom to share knowledge rather than hoard it. Whether I lived long enough to see that new world take shape remained an open question. But I was determined to keep trying, one frozen community at a time, until either the Ice Age ended or my luck ran out. The knowledge I carried was too valuable to die with me, and there were too many people counting on the voice of the water guy to disappear into the frozen wilderness without a fight.